I never thought I'd see him again. Not after what happened, not after everything he put me through. But there he was, lying on that gurney in the emergency room, his face pale and twisted in pain, eyes searching desperately for someone to save him. And that someone was me. My name is Dr. Michael Henderson, and I've been practicing cardiology at Massachusetts General Hospital for 12 years now. I've seen thousands of patients walk through those doors. I've held hands during final breaths. I've delivered news that shattered families. I've celebrated miracles. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the moment Robert Caldwell rolled into my ER on that cold February evening. 23 years ago, Robert Caldwell wasn't a patient. He was my high school chemistry teacher at Lincoln High in Boston. More than that, he was the man who nearly destroyed my future before it even began. I was 17, a shy kid from a working-class neighborhood in Dorchester. My father drove a delivery truck. My mother cleaned offices at night. They worked themselves to exhaustion so I could have a shot at something better. I wanted to be a doctor more than anything in this world. It was my entire universe, my reason for existing. I studied until my eyes burned. I tutored other students to save money for college applications. Every single grade mattered. Mr. Caldwell taught advanced chemistry, the class I needed to ace for my college transcript. He was demanding, cold, always impeccably dressed in pressed shirts and expensive watches. He had favorites in that class, kids whose parents were lawyers and professors, kids who summered on the Cape. I wasn't one of them. I worked twice as hard as anyone else just to keep up. The midterm exam was worth 40% of our grade. I studied for 6 weeks straight. I memorized every equation, every reaction, every single detail from our textbook. The night before the test, I barely slept. When I sat down in that classroom, my pencil felt like an extension of my hand. I knew every answer. I was certain I'd aced it. 2 weeks later, Caldwell handed back our exams. Mine had a large red F scrawled across the top. My stomach dropped through the floor. Impossible, I'd known every answer. I approached his desk after class, barely able to speak. He looked at me with something I can only describe as contempt. He accused me of cheating, said my answers were too similar to another student's. Said someone like me couldn't possibly understand material at that level without help. Someone like me. Those words echoed in my head for years afterward. I tried to defend myself. I showed him my notes, my practice tests, everything. He wouldn't listen. He reported me to the administration. The accusation went on my permanent record pending investigation. My college applications were frozen. Harvard Medical School, my dream since I was 10 years old, suddenly felt impossibly far away. My parents were devastated. They couldn't understand what had happened. I couldn't explain it to them because I didn't understand it myself. For 3 months, I lived in a nightmare. The other students whispered when I walked by. Teachers looked at me differently. I felt like everything I'd worked for was crumbling beneath my feet. The investigation took forever. They finally cleared me when another teacher reviewed my exam and confirmed my work was original. But the damage was done. My applications went out late. My grades suffered because I couldn't focus. I spent that entire spring in a fog of shame and anger. When acceptance letters arrived, I got into decent schools, but not Harvard. Not my dream. I ended up at Boston University, a good school, but it wasn't what I'd planned for. It wasn't what I'd sacrificed everything for. I carried that rage with me through undergraduate studies, through medical school at Tufts, through my residency. It fueled me. I became obsessed with proving myself, with showing everyone that I belonged in those rooms where decisions about life and death were made. Eventually, I let it go. I had to. Holding on to that anger was poisoning me from the inside. I built a good life. I became an excellent cardiologist. I met Sarah, married her, had 2 beautiful daughters. I bought my parents a house so they could finally rest. I found peace in my work and helping people, in the small victories that come with saving a life. Robert Caldwell became a distant memory, a shadow from another lifetime. Until that February evening when he appeared on my schedule as a patient transfer from a community hospital in Salem. He'd suffered a massive heart attack. His anterior descending artery was 90% blocked. Without immediate intervention, he would die within hours. The attending physician had called ahead to warn me it was critical. When I walked into that exam room and saw his face, everything inside me went still. He recognized me instantly. I watched the realization wash over his features, watched him understand exactly who would be holding his life in their hands. His mouth opened, but no words came out. We stood there in that fluorescent-lit room, separated by decades and so much unspoken pain. My first instinct was to walk away, to call another cardiologist, transfer his case, pretend I hadn't seen him. Nobody would have questioned it. Conflict of interest is a legitimate reason for recusal. I could have let someone else handle it and never looked back, but I didn't move. I stood there looking at this man who had once held so much power over me, who had nearly derailed everything I'd become, and I saw something I hadn't expected. Fear. Pure, unfiltered terror. He knew he was dying, and he knew I was the only person in that hospital who could save him. The professional side of me kicked in almost automatically. I started running through the procedure in my mind, calculating risks, considering options. His chart showed elevated troponin levels, irregular EKG readings, significant damage already done to the heart muscle. He needed an emergency catheterization followed by possible bypass surgery. Time was critical. Every minute we delayed increased his chances of permanent damage or death. My nurse, Patricia, was watching me carefully. She's worked with me for 8 years. She knows when something's wrong. I could feel her question without her speaking it. Robert finally found his voice. It came out weak, barely above a whisper. He said my name. Not Dr. Henderson. Michael. Like we were still teacher and student, like those 23 years hadn't happened. He apologized. Right there, with his heart failing and death breathing down his neck, he apologized for what he'd done to me. He said he'd thought about it over the years, that it had haunted him. He said he was wrong. He said he was sorry. The words felt hollow, and far too late. They didn't erase anything. They didn't give me back that acceptance letter from Harvard. They didn't undo the shame I'd carried through my teenage years. But standing there looking at him gasping for air, I realized something fundamental. This wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't about revenge or justice or evening the score. This was about who I had become despite him. I'd taken an oath. I'd sworn to heal people regardless of who they were or what they'd done. That oath didn't come with exceptions for people who'd hurt me. It didn't have a clause that said I could pick and choose based on personal history. If I walked away from him now, I wouldn't be punishing Robert Caldwell. I'd be betraying everything I'd fought so hard to become. I performed the catheterization that night. It took 4 hours. His blockage was worse than the initial scans had shown. I had to place 3 stents to restore blood flow to his heart. My team was exceptional, moving with precision and focus. Nobody knew the history between us. To them, he was just another patient who needed saving, and that's exactly how I treated him. Every decision I made was based purely on medical necessity. I didn't cut corners, but I didn't go out of my way either. I did exactly what I would have done for any other patient in his condition. He survived the procedure. His recovery was slow but steady. I checked on him during rounds over the next few days, keeping my visits brief and professional. He tried to talk to me several times to explain himself, to apologize again. I didn't want to hear it. I wasn't interested in his reasons or his guilt. What he'd done to me had shaped my life in ways he couldn't begin to understand. Some of those ways were good. I'd developed resilience, determination, a drive that had made me an exceptional physician, but some of those ways were scars that never fully healed. On his last day before discharge, he asked to speak with me privately. Against my better judgment, I agreed. He told me about his own life, about the pressure he'd been under at that school, about his failing marriage at the time, about his own insecurities that had made him cruel to a kid who reminded him of everything he'd never accomplished. He said seeing students like me, so hungry and determined, had made him feel small. So he'd tried to make me smaller too. It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it made him human in a way I'd never allowed before. I told him something I'd never admitted to anyone except Sarah. I told him that what he did to me had nearly broken me, but ultimately it had made me better at my job. Because I remembered what it felt like to be dismissed, to have someone assume I wasn't good enough based on nothing but their own prejudice. I never wanted to make any patient feel that way. I never wanted anyone in my care to feel invisible or unworthy. In some twisted way, his cruelty had taught me empathy. Not because of anything he intended, but because I'd learned firsthand how much damage a person in power could do with their assumptions and biases. He left the hospital 3 weeks later with prescriptions and follow-up appointments. I never saw him again after that. I don't know if he kept his appointments with the cardiologist I referred him to. I don't know if he changed his life or went back to teaching or retired to Florida. And honestly, I don't need to know. Saving his life wasn't about forgiveness. It wasn't about moving on or finding closure. It was about being the person I'd fought so hard to become, the doctor who sees every patient as a life worth saving regardless of history or hurt. That night in the emergency room, I had a choice. I could have let my past define my present, could have let old wounds dictate my actions. Instead, I chose to be the physician I'd always wanted to be. And in that choice, I finally freed myself from Robert Caldwell's power over me. Not because he apologized, but because I proved to myself that I was bigger than his small-mindedness had ever been. That's the real victory. Not revenge, not even forgiveness. Just the quiet certainty that I'd done the right thing when it mattered most.